Okay, the first thing that I would like to hear from you is what it was like while you were at SRI before you started working with Doug, when you kind of saw these guys down the hall feeling, you wonder what they were doing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay, well, I think you have to look at the times. It was late 60s, early 70s, and I worked in an area where I had to meet the public, so I wore things like suits and high heels and back-combed hair and so forth. And there was a group of people up on the second floor of one of our buildings, and they were sitting on the floor staring at television sets and looked like hippies and had beards and Birkenstocks and looked mostly dressed like unmade beds. And so they were quite different for the dead. Everybody would say, what are they doing up there? And Doug would go around saying, well, you're all going to be doing this someday. And we'd think, oh boy, is he weird. But he was right. Doug was always way ahead of his time, in my opinion. And that he would come down. I worked as an information scientist, so he would come down and talk to me. They were building NIC tools in those days, or thinking about them.
Could you explain what a NIC is?
NIC was well, this was on the early ARPANET, and there were two main services on the network, which one was the NIC, which was the Network Information Center, and one was the NOC, which was the Network Operations Center. The NIC was funded at SRI, and the NOC was funded at both Brannick and Newman. So, but in the early days, Doug's system looked like it would be an ideal system in which to build this new concept of an online information center. So they were just looking for ideas and tools, and sometimes he'd come down and chat with me. And that's how I got to know him. And then I got a little bored where I was, and so one day I went up and I said, why don't you hire me? And he said, oh, gee, right now we don't have a job. And I said, oh, okay. And so he came down a while later and said, we can hire you now, we have a job. And I said, what is it? And he said, we need somebody to put together a resource handbook for this demonstration in '72, I think it was. It was going to be the first demonstration of the ARPANET. And I said, what's a resource handbook? And he said, well, I'm not quite sure I know, but we need one by September. So I joined his group, and that was my first assignment, was to put together work on the resource handbook. That was, I believe, '72. And then I'd have to check the dates exactly, but I think it was '74. Then I took over the NIC project and became the principal investigator, which is a job I had for 20-some years. I left SRI in '89. I was still principal investigator for the NIC, although it had grown in size by then. So I was kind of launched into this group of Birkenstocks and jeans, and people didn't wear clothes like that in those days, so they were quite unique. It was just starting. It was a big San Francisco thing, so it was a fascinating group, really interesting people.
I'm just going to move your mic a little bit, because I can hear a little movement. Can I move it to the other side?
Sure.
Yes, if we do, actually, just do something similar to what you had. Just twist it slightly, like, because now it has nothing to rub up against. So let's do another subject. Just say 1, 2, 3.
And as far as computers in those days, we had Burroughs, which did things like the accounting, and I believe we had some CDC machine, which did mostly Fortran mathematics for physicists and scientists. And that was everybody's view of a computer. You walked up with a set of cards and you stuck it in a hole, and then it came back later and got us a stack of paper. So interacting computing was almost unheard of at that point.
At what point?
Around 1970, 72.
What was, could you talk some more about working in that group? What it was like, what the dynamics were like?
Well, it was interesting because the equipment was very expensive in those days. A workstation was expensive. The computers cost over $1 million. We didn't have enough workstations for everyone, so we had to take turns. People worked inordinate hours to get done what they wanted to do. We had lots of arguments. I wasn't so much in this loop, but the programmers particularly had lots of arguments about what would go on the machine, because the system that they were building, first of all, it was one large system all integrated. And second of all, if anybody had a new idea and they wanted to try it out, you didn't have another computer to do that on. It was all done on one computer, which even though it took up a room, had very little real space on it to do work. So that was always a problem. Would it fit on the computer? And then when you're working on one system, it's difficult because these were research people and they wanted to try new things all the time. And so you couldn't always do that. You couldn't always, and we didn't have a duplicate of the system, so you couldn't always just go off and do something totally different. And there were lots of, back and forth about, could we do this? And then they'd say, well, let's come up with some particular piece of the system that we need. I'll just pick one. Let's say it was a debugger. And somebody might want to write it one way, and somebody might want to write it another way. So there's a lot of back and forth until some consensus was hit upon by the people that were going to be involved, or it might impact the rest of the system some way. So sometimes the arguments got pretty bizarre, and Doug had a pair of, I don't know if everybody's seen these styrofoam boffers, and they were hung on the wall like a set of arms. And if the arguments got too intense, they got sent out in the hall, and they had to boff it out for a while until tempers got down, and people got back to. And mostly they were technical arguments; they were personal arguments. But it was that intense that there was so many ideas roaming around, and so many people were just so excited about trying things, and so it was intense. It was exciting. It was difficult because you had to fight for your idea if you wanted to get in there.
Sure.
And I think that was the tenor of the whole ARPANET, with the RFCs and people being able to present ideas. Then they had to defend them, and it was kind of the way business was done then. But I think it very much started in Doug's group because of a lot of people working on one integrated system.
What kind of people? How would you describe them as a group?
Very creative. Some were pretty single-minded. I think that programming in itself tends to be somewhat black and white. I mean, either it works or it doesn't work. You do this or you do that. But I joke and say that really great programmers are two-faced, because some of the programmers that worked for Doug were some of the best. And they had this uncanny way of seeing a whole system in their heads. They knew where they were headed. They knew what they wanted it to look like. And yet they could get clear down to the nitty-gritty of bits, and to make sure that it did what they wanted it to do. So to me, it seemed, coming in from the outside, it seemed like they were phenomenal, and that they could do both of these things. They could see this huge picture. Anybody that worked on a system had to have a picture of this whole system and how everything fit in for openers. And then if they were building something, it might be brand new that nobody else had done. They had to know how all that would fit in. Then as protocols came along, they had everything they were doing had to fit with the protocols. So it was very exciting, and it took a very dedicated and I think talented person to do the work, to build the system. Then there were many of us, I wasn't a system builder, I was more of a system user. That was frustrating at times. You try to get a job done, and there was this crowded machine, and we all had to stand in line to use it. Well, the users always were fighting the developers because each wanted their place in the sun. So that was kind of interesting too. And I was trying to get out a handbook, which was maybe about 3 inches thick. And it was In those days, you had to go to printers and they typeset things, and we were trying not to do that. So we were trying to break some new ground too. We would get things off of line printers that didn't copy over very well to printed pages, and the line printers would break down, and everything would happen. But it was a great challenge to try to get something to actually come out of the system if you were a user. On the other hand, I always say I started with the best, and it's been downhill ever since. So it was really a phenomenal system. I not being a programmer, probably didn't appreciate half of what was in it.
Would you consider that system harder or easier to use than what you use today for your daily work? Macro windows?
Well, at the time, nobody knew any of this. A lot of what we do now, we take for granted. You're going to have a lot of background to start with. As a matter of fact, I get programs now that don't come with manuals.
Yeah.
You just wend your way through it. And John Q. Public does that now. I mean, these were people that were working on a system that nobody had ever heard of before, had never touched, had never thought of.
Yeah.
So it was a whole different ball game. It was a lot harder to take it out to user levels further out and further out. I didn't think the basics were that hard to learn, but if you wanted to use all of the facility that was in that program, yes, that would have taken time. But then that would be true today.
Right.
I mean, if somebody wants to be an ace C programmer, they've got a lot of learning to do, but there was nowhere to go to get that learning. That was another thing. There weren't classes, there weren't courses.
But for the work you did to produce the manual, the handbook, that daily kind of work, was that, because obviously now there's this big fashion of ease of use, did you find that when you were interacting with it hard to use compared to, let's say, Microsoft Word kind of work today? Oh
no, it was very easy to work in the machine. The biggest problem we had was getting from the machine to the way people would reproduce things in those days. That took some doing because, and it's still a problem. I still have that problem today. I'm never quite sure. Let's say I scan something in an OCR. Well, it's not going to come out on the scan page necessarily the way it was on the printed page. So there were some interface problems. I would say those were the biggest. But the actual working, putting the information in, working it around, citing references, that kind of thing, was really quite phenomenal. It was very good. And it was an eye-opener if you had done all this stuff, with typewriters and whiteout and that sort of thing. So it was very good.
What do you think were some of the greatest, what do you think is the legacy of that group that actually made it into the world, not just what Doug wanted to, that may or may not have made it into the world?
Well, I think it set the pace for most of the things we're doing in our, as he called them, knowledge workers, that they're doing today, what we do in offices, what we do in research labs and so forth. When they had the demonstration in '72, it showed the possibilities of mixed text and graphics. It had an email system in it. It had editing capabilities. It had printing capabilities. It had all kinds of programming. And the thing that I thought was interesting about it is as you sat at your desk, at your terminal, you brought all this in with a command. You didn't have to keep loading new programs. You didn't have to keep learning the syntax of some other program. And I find that difficult today. I mean, I wish there was more of an overview that was the same for the user, because the user has to keep, it's not too different, but it's different enough that you have to keep learning all the little idiosyncrasies of a new program. In Engelbart's system, all of the pieces of it fit together. And I watched programmers write programs, which I say I'm not a programmer, but it was fascinating to see what they could turn out as opposed to programmers I'd worked for that were doing punch cards and batch jobs and that kind of thing. So I think it was a phenomenal breakthrough. It also set the tone, I think, when people saw that demonstration, and Doug spent much of his time demonstrating to various people who were knowledgeable and would move this kind of thing out into their fields. I think it laid out possibilities for them. They thought, wow, I never even thought about doing it this way, you know. It was pretty amazing. I found the mouse and key set was wonderful I did a lot of editing because, you know, maybe writing a document and then go get edits and so forth. The key set meant, and the mouse, you could type all the letters on the key set. And with the mouse, you could do uppercase, lowercase, different characters that would be on your keyboard. So you could just sit there going like this, and now you have to keep coming back to the keyboard. Well, if you miss a key, you know, you're off a key or something like that, which is easy to do when you're jumping back and forth. So I found as an editing system, it was really fast and interesting because I just sit there, you know, going like this, and I never had to keep jumping back to the keyboard unless I wanted to type in a lot of text.
1, 2, 3, yeah.
Okay. With the mouse and the key set was with your left hand, the mouse with your right hand. You could do all the letters and numbers with the key set, and then you could do upper and lower case and a lot of unusual characters with the mouse, the combinations of the two. And that meant that when you were typing and editing, particularly just making changes, you didn't have to go back to the keyboard. So you would just be sitting there going like this. But now when I have to do that, I have to, you know, I have to go back to the keyboard to make a change. And I found that was very, very fast. And I'm sorry that they didn't bring the key set along when they brought the mouse.
Hang on, not quite ready. Okay, great.
Well, I can't speak for SRI's upper management, what all the decision making was in the decision to spin the group off to timeshare. I think there were several things that probably led into it. Funding was tight, but mainly Doug had a group called Knowledge Workers Architect Community, and this was in his attempt to move systems out and move the concepts out into bigger communities. The problem was that this was what SRI called a multi-client project, and each group that was involved would contribute money, and then everybody in the group got all the results of the project. And this is done frequently, but what happened as you started to move this out into bigger communities, then you had users, and users just wanted to use it to get their work done. It also meant that the group had to put more of their time into things like user manuals, training, more maintenance things than research things. I don't know, but I think this looked maybe a little to SRI's management as if we were selling a product as opposed to doing research. And we were a nonprofit research organization that would have had an impact on our status. I think the ideas were to move part of the group out to timeshare to work on coming up with a commercial system and keeping research people at SRI. However, the group, being the group, had ideas of their own. They didn't want to be split up, and they maybe this wasn't discussed with them to begin with, so that they had some input. So they resisted it. They incorporated themselves as a group, and then they made SRI and Timeshare talk to them as an incorporated group. So I don't think the idea in the first place was that everybody was to go off into a commercial environment. But that is my own take on it. I wasn't involved. I wasn't in management. I wasn't involved in the decision making.
The other thing about TCP/IP.
Oh, and then I think another thing that was happening is early on in the days of the ARPANET, I think the first concept of the ARPANET was would it be a resource sharing network? And this was mainly because there were some very big computers mostly at defense sites that they wanted to share with researchers. Otherwise, the researchers had to go there. They had to stand in line to be in a queue to use the machines. And they thought if they could network them, that would save, would help the researchers, and would also save a lot of funds. But as people got onto the network, and especially once email became a user program on the network, that just changed everything. It was everybody was wanting to use email and wanting to talk to each other.
Sorry, the button is
sorry.
getting too close. No, it's just good. Okay, right.
So then I think the emphasis started away from resource sharing and started towards interconnectivity. Well, there was interconnectivity work being done to start with, but there was more emphasis on this. So then that meant more emphasis on protocols and led to TCP/IP. Then the military decided they would adopt TCP/IP. So almost all the emphasis was on implementing TCP/IP and the new suite of protocols on all the host machines. So the emphasis of research changed from what you were doing on any one machine as to a product or a program that could be used. It changed from that to could all the hosts be interconnected and could people communicate over this network? So I think that had a lot to do with funding. Doug's group had a lot to do with protocol design. They were part of almost all the early protocols. Someone in his group was involved. Then John Postel joined the group, and we had a packet radio project at SRI, and I believe the first implementation of TCP/IP was done at SRI by one of Vince Cerf's graduate students, I believe. I'd have to check that out. I think Jim Mathis was the person that did the first implementation. But anyway, then we were involved in the National Software Works. That again was trying to adapt software so that it was easier to put on networks and so forth. So I think the emphasis changed. That probably had something to do with what happened to Doug's group. I think Doug himself wanted to stay working on his concepts and his system, and the world was going in a different direction.
Doug, you said he felt he didn't publish enough. Do you agree with that?
Well, it was a time when the buzzword was publish or perish. And yes, it was important to publish things. And with the network, it was like you were very schizophrenic, because the network, people published on the network and people knew what was going on in the network. They didn't always know this on the outside. Most of the funders were on the outside in those days. Not always, but there was this, there were like two venues that were going side by side that weren't always in, talking to each other. I came from the background of chemistry, and all the publication work was very standardized and stylized. You knew where to publish. You looked to see if somebody had already published and so forth. This world wasn't like that in the computer world at that particular time. You could look back and say, yes, he perhaps should have published more. We all should have. But it was a fast-moving world. You didn't always have the time to do all the things you wanted to do.
What about the concern that Doug he was more interested in his research than being political with funders, with SRI management, and within his own group? Did you get that feeling?
Well, yes and no. I would say no. Doug was amazing at bringing in people from other disciplines and sitting down with them and showing them what the possibilities were. He just had a knack for attracting people to come, and that took up a lot of his time. And it took up some of the staff time too. But I think he was very concerned about doing this and showing people what the possibilities were and finding out what they were doing. He was always doing, I guess you call it bootstrapping, but for himself and for other groups. I remember a person that came from the Army, and Doug showed them the possibilities of electronic mail. And I think it was probably that particular meeting that started the U.S. Army using electronic mail. Now that's pretty significant when you think about it. That might be a little overstated, but I know that person got very excited about it, went back and, really started a movement in a sense to get that going. We had the same thing with our contracting officers at REDC. They were actual users of the system, and so Doug did a lot.
Sorry, I have to move this again because of your children.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry that it's so finicky. Okay, there we go. But with talking about the other users,
Doug did a lot with trying to let other people know and understand what he was doing. And in all fairness to Doug, SRI had a steady stream of people they would send up to him to do the same thing. So I don't know, but he had a direction he wanted to go in. It wasn't always a direction that funding wanted to go in, or that a contract source would want him to go in. So contracts tend to be very specific. We want you to do this, this, and this because we have a need. When you're building a system and you're trying to design, the next world, that's not always the way you approach it. So I think there was probably a mismatch there at times. This was not the days when there was venture capital, when there was seed money to try something. It was very hard to get that kind of money. So those were always problems.
Considering that you worked on this till '89, what is your impression of why Doug didn't manage to expand later on with this? Is that wrapped up in your previous concern why he stopped working at SRI, or do you think it was something different?
Well, I think, as I said, I think he always was a little ahead of his time, or a lot ahead of his time. The machines were very small, and the system was big. The ideas were big. The number of staff it took, or that wanted to do this sort of thing, versus the amount of money you had, was not always a match. So there were many things, but mostly I think the equipment, the hardware just wasn't there. I mean, nowadays you could have, several instances of systems that you were trying different things on. That wasn't possible in those days.
So why do you think then over the last 30 years he's never been able to get funding again?
That I don't know. I think he was not in, most of the funding came from government academic sources, and he wasn't in that world for quite a while. And now I think he's back, he's back in that world and making quite an impact. It was probably not in his best interest to be in the commercial world for as long as he was. I don't know that. I don't even know what was done there, but I think he learned a lot. He talked about the things, real big problems that people had to deal with, and he could see what the issues were. However, I don't know whether that worked for him personally.
That's very interesting. When you say he is back in that world now, what do you see as being the current positive developments as far as, not necessarily Doug personally, but as far as Doug's philosophy and work is concerned?
Well, I think if I understand from my conversations with Doug, what his real interest is the way people communicate with each other and using whatever tools are at their disposal. And I think his emphasis was always on the communication process, how it's done, how you move all this stuff into an environment. And I don't know if anybody's come from the environment where you use pencil, paper, and typewriters into the computer environment, what we're doing today. It took a long time. So when he was talking about this in the early days, people frankly didn't really always know what he was talking about. It's still difficult. I mean, we have lots of information, we have lots of tools. I'm still not sure we have the right communication process. There's lots of things that don't work in the internet, as some of you know, that get, spam in every direction when you turn on your machine. Those things are matters of communication, and I think Doug feels that if groups learn to use these tools and their group interactions well, they can optimize how they get things done in the world. He could explain this much better than I can.
That was very good. Could you go back again to what you feel of Doug's vision and work, if it really is in the world, even if you repeat some of it, I'm just trying different ways for you to say that. Of what, because I've had very, very different people say very, very different things of what they feel this current living legacy is.
Well, I think aside from some of the fascinating tools he's come up with and his group, his real concern is that these tools be used for communication, that groups of people that maybe don't know how to communicate or...
I can't believe I did that. Okay, if you just go used for communication.
Yes. I'm sorry.
I just kicked the camera. So
Oh, okay.
You could just start with to use for communication.
I think that, to me, in my talks with Doug, I think that is what his real bottom line is. Because if what we're doing doesn't augment people, then why do it? If we're not doing our jobs better, if we're not communicating better, if we're not coming up with more answers for mankind, for world intercommunications, then why do it? It's maybe you can say, well, do it because it's faster, but just spewing out information is not necessarily a time saver, because then you have to figure out what to do with all this stuff. I think anybody now people have personal computers, they're faced with some of these problems themselves on their own machine, then they're faced with interacting with others, too much information, ways to organize it, and all of that, if we really work on that as a total system of communication, can really augment what we do. It can make getting to the meat of communication much better. I'm not sure it's there yet. To me, sometimes it's more of a hindrance, depending on what you're doing and what gets in the way.
But what that's very good, and I agree with that very strongly, and I think that is what he says. But what are the things that came out of Doug's lab? I mean, the maps is a specific thing. What are some more either social ways of doing stuff or capabilities that you feel really came from Doug's lab, rather than were co-invented somewhere else or didn't really get into the lab?
Well, Doug now has his bootstrap community, and that's an interesting word to use, because I think that's what people did do. In many disciplines, they'll sit around and talk something to death, and then they'll write a position paper and blah, 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 and it goes on like that. Nobody ever does anything or makes a decision. In this world, things were built, the tires were kicked, the good stuff was talked about, criticized, emphasized, upgraded, and then you do a rerun of it and get it better. So that's what, to my mind, is bootstrapping. You can do that with a program you're writing, you can do that with a concept you've come up with, or you can do that with a community that is trying to communicate with each other. And I think that whole way of doing business is something that he emphasized very much at the beginning. The group that worked with him, and also I think this was a way that the business was done on the internet too, was that when you did protocols, you built them, you tried them, you kicked the tires, you tried it out, and then you said, this works. And somebody else could jump in and say, it doesn't work on my system. Well, this was bootstrapping, and this whole concept of bootstrapping, I think early on was one that they used in their particular lab. It's one that I think carried out to the internet. It's a way of making something better, that everybody gets to participate. It's difficult. It's very difficult. You can't be a shrinking violet in that kind of an environment. If you have an idea, you have to get it out there, and you have to be willing to take your knocks. If somebody thinks it's a bad idea, they'll let you know. So I think to some extent that is a difficult, it's difficult, but it's very honest. And I think people basically understand that when you do business that way. And also if you're trying to move something out to large communities, it can save a lot of time, it can save a lot of money to start out small, see how it works, move it out to a little larger community and so forth. And I think from a practical point of view, I think it's a reasonable approach, and also from a philosophical, better augmented procedures, it's a good approach. And I think that's his underlying philosophy, and he's used it in many approaches, in many situations. It's so simple that people think it's not important.
I agree. Let me just think. What other aspects do you think it's important to comment on that we haven't talked about so far?
I'm sorry,
What do you think is missing? What else do you think it's important to talk about?
Well, I really think that Doug needs to be in an environment where he is provided with research funds so he can try some of these things, so he can get his A community together. That does take a bit of faith and a fair amount of money, but I think that the fallout from that can be incredible. He's proven over the years that this concept has worked. It's produced incredible things, and I think it's got a lot further to go. I would like to see somebody fund him in a way that he can put together. He has this knack for putting together incredible groups of people that are terribly motivated to do some of these things, and I'd like to see him be able to have that environment again. I think that's what we had back in the 60s, 70s, and it was very exhilarating, and an incredible amount of good ideas came out of it.
Cool.
I would say that some of the people from Doug's group went on to almost all of the major companies in Silicon Valley. That's not always clear, but people went off to Adobe, people went off to Xerox, people went off to Apple, people went, that's the kind of ideas that he spread out into the community. So I think if you have to look at the whole picture to know what Doug did and how important it was.
Yeah.